Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend. And for those of you that are in the Dallas area, aren't you glad to see the sun? Because it felt like Seattle and Portland, where, of course, I live for a while, and certainly have enjoyed taking a walk this morning in the sun instead of with a raincoat on. But nevertheless, we have a lot to cover, and we will do so. Next hour, we're going to be talking about this book, Winsome Conviction, written by the two authors that actually wrote an earlier one called Winsome Persuasion. What do you do with all the disagreement in the body of Christ right now? Well, we'll see if we can try to give some answers to that, and so we'll spend some time talking with them. I will, too, try to cover a number of issues here. The Texas legislature now has a budget, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about Texas, but I know most of you listening this hour are from Texas and might have a slight concern and question about that, so I'll give you an update. Those of you in other states, well, your legislature is dealing with the same issues as well. We're going to talk about the vaccine rollout. That's an issue that certainly is there. And who thought that all the riots and protests were over? Well, they aren't in places like Portland and Seattle, by the way, since I just mentioned that a minute ago. But I thought I'd start out with a sports illustration. May be appropriate since, again, congratulations to the Kansas City Chiefs and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But those of you that love sports, and I got three guys around the table that do, if I say Curse of the Bambino, you probably know what that is because of the fact that for a long time it didn't look like the Red Sox would ever come back and even make it to the World Series, much less win it. Well, that kind of ended. But people have talked about curses in sports. Another one that I've certainly identified is the so-called Sports Illustrated cover jinx or curse as well. Oftentimes, if you're on the cover of Sports Illustrated, your sports career kind of goes in the tank. Why am I saying that? There seems to be a curse in politics. And the curse that I've begun to identify is that if you, in the political realm, as a pundit or even a politician, dismiss and reject and lampoon the cancel culture, sooner or later, oftentimes sooner, you get canceled by the cancel culture. What am I talking about? Well, if you pay attention to social media, it turns out that Lauren Wolf was actually let go from the New York Times. And she has put out one or two tweets, but one of the ones that probably was most prominent came back in August, and she was making fun of this idea that there's a cancel culture, making fun of the idea that this is anything that's real. And so the mock tweet, I'm looking at it right now, doesn't make a lot of sense unless you see it in context, but she say, how hilarious it is, the refrain of a cancel culture. And you can laugh about a cancel culture until the cancel culture comes back and takes you out. And so the writer here says, like clockwork, anytime someone in the left is canceled, it almost always turns out that previously they laughed at the idea that the cancel culture even exists. The arrogance of such is not lost on those sitting back and observing how the left eats its own. And we have seen this before. And if nothing else, this writer then goes on to say, the right has been warning for years that this is not healthy, yet Wolf and her colleagues mocked any discussion of the matter at all. Now they have to live by their new rules. And so there is a sense in which you sort of say, well, what goes around comes around, but nevertheless, it's just something to pay attention to. And we had a discussion off air about, well, what's the difference between maybe a boycott and a cancel culture? Well, first of all, most Americans have allowed people to say some really stupid things in letters to the editor and in other forums long before we had Twitter and Facebook and the rest. And most of the time, there'd be a comment back to them or an argument that they make no sense. But there's always been, I think, up until fairly recently, a general sort of live and let live kind of philosophy that says, look, if you said something stupid, as now we're starting to see on Snapchat when you were 15 years of age, that should not disqualify you from being accepted to a university. Can we all at least agree with that? I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, whether you're Christian or non-Christian. That just seems too extreme. On the other hand, the question I got the other day when I was speaking at Dallas Theological Seminary is, well, okay, what's the difference between the cancel culture and some of the Christians at that time were calling for people not to subscribe to Netflix or to cancel their Netflix subscription? And I said, well, okay, I recognize there is some difference because you are concerned about something they did. First of all, people cancel their Netflix subscription for all sorts of reasons or for no reason at all. Some of it's financial, some of it is I don't like what's on there, and that's just sort of in the market. That would be very different than if one of the employees of Netflix said something you disagreed with, and then you tried to bring the whole force of all of your tribe against that individual and get that individual fired. That's a little bit different, I think. Are there similarities? Sure. Are there differences? Yes. And if nothing else, it gets me into my favorite other question, and that is this a distinction without a difference? And that one is illustrated by the fact that Jeff Bezos, you know who he is, owns Amazon. Well, it turns out Jeff Bezos and Amazon are opposed to mail-in balloting. They don't want mail-in voting. Now, wait a minute. They've actually come out. Matter of fact, the Washington Post, which is owned by Amazon, actually came out in favor of mail-in balloting. No, they're only opposing mail-in balloting for a union election to decide whether or not to unionize Amazon. Oh, I see. And so what is so interesting here is the petition, which was uploaded, says that they have concerns about election security and using the unreliable electronic signature platform. And so then the lawyers tried to piously explain that mail-in balloting in union elections is fundamentally different than mail-in balloting for political elections. What's their justification? Well, they say in political elections, the Amazon lawyers argue, and I'm quoting them now, there is a continuously updated voter address roll, and as a result, the ability to vote in person or by mail actually would promote security and voter turnout. There's a good example of making a distinction without a difference. Do you really, honestly, with a straight face, believe that we have continuously updated voter rolls for our political elections? And you know the answer to that is no. And so the argument is, well, we can allow mail-in balloting because, after all, we have all of these various locales, all of these various states that have completely updated voter rolls. And if you think that that is true, just hearken back to Friday when Penna Dexter was on here talking about the fact that she actually was wanting to help get out the vote in Georgia. And she was talking about the number of people that she called that are on the voter rolls, then found out that those individuals, although they're on the Georgia voter rolls, had left Georgia sometimes years ago. So nevertheless, it's just another great illustration of, well, we like mail-in balloting and we like mail-in voting when it's in a political election because we think it really is going to help the Democratic Party. But now when it comes for Amazon to have mail-in voting for a union election, we think that is much too dangerous. And if you don't see the irony, maybe even, dare I use the word hypocrisy? Well, I can't really do any more for you, but it's just an illustration of some of the rather humorous things I saw over the weekend. And if you didn't see them, well, you heard them first here on Point of View. We come back, let me spend just a few minutes talking about what's happening in the Texas legislature, because after all, it will affect your taxes, and that's an important issue, so we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will the federal government move to regulate big tech? I think that is unlikely for many reasons I will delineate in a moment, but I can't deny that there is growing concern about censorship on various social media platforms. It started with disclaimers on social media posts and is now expanded to banning politicians and commentators, and even an attempt to destroy an alternative social media platform. House Intelligence Committee ranking member Devin Nunes called for a RICO investigation of big tech. Here's a simple test. If no investigation takes place in the next month or so, then you can assume that there will be no regulation of big tech. The common argument is that these social media organizations are private companies and therefore should not be governed by First Amendment protections against censorship. The authors of a Wall Street Journal op-ed argue that these companies should be treated as state actors under existing legal doctrines. The Supreme Court has ruled that government cannot encourage private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. They argue that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunizes them from liability, does that. Although Donald Trump and a number of members of Congress called for a repeal of Section 230, I doubt that that will happen under this administration that is already showing itself to favor Silicon Valley and the influence of big tech. Even if someday Congress were to remove those protections, I think it is likely that these huge companies would probably withstand any court challenge. Big tech has become the social media leviathan with unchecked power to ban people from their platforms and censor content. But I don't see much courage on the part of the new administration or Congress to challenge its actions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, just thought I would spend just a few minutes talking about the Texas legislature, because one of the few constitutionally mandated actions for the legislature, and this is true in other states as well, so whether you live in Texas or not, that is the case, is to actually provide a balanced budget. Many people have said what is good for the state should be good for the federal government, but that has never been the case, and we have always spent, and I mean, it doesn't matter whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether we have a Republican-controlled Congress or Democratic-controlled Congress, we have always spent more money than we bring in. And yet again, the national debt, by the time Ronald Reagan left office, was about a little over $1 trillion. And now when we're talking about $27 trillion, you can see where the greatest damage took place, and that is within these last 2 decades. But let's go on. And that is to recognize as well that the Texas House and Senate, in order to fulfill their mandate, have put together their base budgets. So what does that mean? Well, a couple of things. First of all, you start with the harsh realization, even in the state of Texas, and if you think it's bad in Texas, it is really very significant and concerning in other states, with a $1 billion shortfall. The comptroller, Glenn Hager, said that the shortfall is about $1 billion. Now, again, that sounds like a lot, but right now, the two budgets that we have from the House and Senate look like they'll probably allocate $119.7 billion in general revenue spending, which is about $3.2 billion less than the spending limit that was established a while back. So in some respects, you have to put some of that in perspective, but still, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, adds up to really significant amount of questions given the cost of living and those kinds of things. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick put it this way: this is not the first time Texas has seen difficult economic times. We are committed to maintaining our fiscal integrity using the conservative budget principles that will ensure Texas remains a job-creating engine for the nation and a major player in the global marketplace. The new Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan, said the decisions we make during the 87th legislative session will have a lasting impact on the future of our state, which is why the House will work to improve our business climate, foster economic prosperity, and do what's right for our students. Now, here's where it is. The baseline budget, if this were passed today, and we know it won't, because everybody's going to want to put some ornaments on the Christmas tree. We know how that goes. But nevertheless, if you look at it right now, these budgets do not raid the rainy day fund. They do not increase taxes. So that's pretty good. And so if later you hear people saying we have to raise taxes, it's because it's raising taxes when so much additional material and various expenses were added to the baseline budget. Of course, it also does not provide any tax relief, but nevertheless, that may be the best you can get in what's called a COVID year. So just thought I'd pass that on, and that's your dollars at work, and you probably won't get a lot of coverage in it because, after all, most of the coverage that comes, especially from the local media, wants to cover something that's visually interesting, and nothing less visually interesting than watching the sausage made down there in Austin. A car wreck gets a lot more attention, even though it only affects the people in the car, than what happens in a city council meeting or what happens in the state legislature meeting. Can we understand that as well? Let me talk about vaccines for just a minute. And good news, bad news, and some of it is bad news because, again, as we talked about on Friday, if you listen, President Biden had a goal of wanting to have 100 million vaccines in 100 days, and so that's 1 million a day. If my math is right, I think it is. And I pointed out that that's a relatively modest goal because, as I was pointing out, I think you end up with about 939,000 vaccines going out on an average. So it's really just saying we're going to increase it by about 60,000 more to get to that 1 million, which I think is something. But when you hear people in the media still say, well, we had no vaccine distribution plan, the plan by Trump was dismal, the difference between the Trump plan that exists right now, because that's really what's working, and the new Biden plan is about the difference in 60,000 vaccines. The biggest problem is not just getting the vaccines out. The problem is getting the vaccines in people's arms. And that is, now we've been doing this for 6 weeks, and it turns out that we have administered 53% of those vaccines. That's pretty pathetic if you think about that, which means the rest, you would hope, are still in dry ice or in refrigerators. We're now hearing some horrible stories of some people that accidentally left them out and they had to throw them all away. But the gap is illustrative, again, of why this is not a federal issue, it's a state issue, and why federalism should work, and probably in some places is. Let's give credit to North Dakota, which has administered 84% of their vaccines. West Virginia has actually administered 83%. That's pretty good, given the fact that there's always a little bit of a lag time in reporting. But compare that to California, which has only administered 45%, Alabama only 47%. And you can see why sometimes federalism works and sometimes why federalism doesn't work. And so the solution to that is not for, I would say, the team Biden to micromanage the state administration of the vaccine, but if nothing else, to just encourage more states to do what they are able to do. And you can imagine if, and all of a sudden, you start having federal agencies administer that who have no, if you will, boots on the ground. I drive by every day a place which is right now a football stadium where individuals are being vaccinated. The fact is they figured that is a location which will best serve people in Collin County, which is where I happen to live. If somebody in Washington, D.C. selects it, they might select something that's on the far north of Collin County, maybe almost halfway to the Oklahoma border, because they don't know where most people tend to drive. They don't know where there are identifiable places where the vaccine would be the most likely to be distributed, and they have no idea of the kind of registration procedures. If there has ever been an argument for federalism, let the people that are in the state and even local areas make those decisions and give them all the encouragement possible and step back and make sure that you get them more vaccines. You're going to hear over the next couple of days in the mainstream media about how we're not producing enough vaccines. Of course, that's all going to be laid at the feet of course, Operation Warp Speed, which I think has done a wonderful job of creating the vaccines. And I think former President Trump deserves some credit for that. He will get none from the mainstream media. But more importantly, if you have only, and again, let me give you that number because it is striking, only 53% of the vaccines that have been distributed have made their way into the arms of individuals. We've got a problem. And trying to solve that by having Team Biden get involved, I don't think is the answer to it. Well, we're talking about vaccines. Are there people dying of the vaccine? Well, this was the most recent announcement. This comes from Placer County in California, not far from where some of our listeners in California actually are located, in which they found an individual who had tested positive for COVID-19, got the vaccine, and then died. Now, the fact that they're talking about these individual cases takes me back to something I said last week. I believe it was on the Wednesday program, might have been on the Monday program, but I think it was on the Wednesday program, when I pointed out that you've had some of these stories saying that there are more than 50 people that have actually died from complications from the vaccine. And at the time I said, there's only one news story that carries this, and then everybody else cites that same story. Nobody else is covering it. So either you've got to believe that the mainstream media is doing a terrible job of covering any kind of reactions to the vaccine, or maybe that particular story is erroneous in one way or the other. And to be fair, that story came from Epoch Times. Not trying to be critical of them, because even in the story, they explain that they're taking it from the Adverse Reactions, the website, which is available through the CDC. But anybody can post on that, even people that are not doctors, not medical personnel. It has some anecdotal stories on there. And of course, the biggest question you always ask is, did the person die because of the vaccine, or did they die with the vaccine? And it's the same question I've asked before when we talked, even last week. You might remember Dr. Merrill Matthews was on the program. Did these people die because of COVID-19, or did they die with COVID-19? And I think we have to be fair on both sides to recognize that in this particular case, here's an individual that already has the coronavirus, maybe has a number of symptoms, and then by giving him or her, because it doesn't even tell us, it says they really are in California trying to be gender neutral, so we don't know if it was a him or her. Do we actually know whether or not it was from the vaccine, or was that person in a latter stage and may have succumbed anyway? So anyway, those are the kinds of stories we are seeing in the news. Thought I would report it. Every time we see one of those, we'll let you know. And we'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347 5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. About half an hour, we're going to be talking about this book, Winsome Conviction, written by the authors that wrote the earlier one, Winsome Persuasion, and we'll talk about disagreeing without dividing the church, a very important topic, and we will get into that. But let me just mention that some of the articles I've posted, the first one on the domestic war on terror, I'll get back to that in just a minute because it deserves a segment perhaps all to itself. But as we are seeing, there is a push to try to have a 9/11 type commission to try to maybe even establish new domestic police powers against what are called domestic terrorists. Now, if you've been following this, they're calling terrorists the individuals who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And let me be clear, I've said before, whether you attack a police officer, whether you're carrying a Trump flag or an Antifa flag, you go to jail. You know, you go on federal property. I don't care if it's a federal courthouse in Portland or the Capitol in Washington, D.C., you go to jail. But the bottom line is all the rioting that has happened actually since January 6th, and actually since the inauguration of Joe Biden, has been where? Portland and Seattle, by groups that are easily identified as Antifa. And so that brings us to, if nothing else, one of the articles that I've posted in which, after all this time, Seattle finally decided maybe they needed to implement a new policy on rioting. But before we get to that new policy that came out over the weekend, let's talk about what happened last week. Okay, Joe Biden was actually inaugurated on Wednesday. That would be January 20th. What happened that night? I'm reading now from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. President Trump has left office, but peace and harmony have not descended upon the land. Left-wing rioters rampaged the streets of Portland, Oregon, and Seattle on Wednesday, no matter Joe Biden's unity plea. In Portland, rioters smashed the windows of the Democratic Party headquarters and scrawled graffiti on the Immigration and Customs Enforcement building. Demonstrators carried signs reading, "We are ungovernable. We don't want Biden. We want revenge for police murders, imperialist wars, and fascist massacres." So again, if you thought this was all about anti-Trump, no, it's really anti-government. Portland police said the rioters carried, are you ready for this? Pepper ball guns, electronic crowd control weapons like tasers, large fireworks, shields, rocks. Weapons were seized, including Molotov cocktails, knives, batons, chemical spray, a crowbar. Some of these don't necessarily fit into the category of peaceful protests. Are you with me on that? Okay. In Seattle, the protesters burned an American flag outside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement office. Rioters shattered the windows of the William Kezo Nakamura Courthouse. An Amazon Go store and a Pike Place Starbucks were actually destroyed. Some chanted at the police, "We protect people, you protect property." And that all happens in Seattle. Again, and the rioters in both cities identified themselves as anarchist or Antifa members who claim to be protesting racism, fascism, and police brutality. Yet in damaging a federal courthouse and Democratic headquarters, they attacked the judiciary and Democratic institutions. That's what happened, and I would have reported that on Thursday, but of course we had Dr. Merrill Matthews sitting here, and Friday, I guess I could have, but sometimes getting a word in edgewise is always difficult on our Friday weekend edition. So let's now go to the next one. And this one came out yesterday. Agents of the Federal Protective Services had to confront over the weekend crowds of rioters in Portland, Oregon. This was a Saturday night protest, firing rounds of tear gas and non-lethal pepper balls at the anti-fascist, if you will, protesters. Saturday night, of course, marked the fourth night of rioting in Portland and the fourth night of a federal response. A response that appears to be largely fallen under the radar since the start of the Biden campaign, because you may actually just be hearing about this right now. Because, you know, if Biden's in office, no harm, no foul. We're not even going to cover it, but we're going to cover it. And then, interestingly enough, something outside of both Portland and Seattle, this one happened in Bellingham, Washington. Now, I do sometimes want to send reporters to school again to get geography, because they described this particular riot in Bellingham, Washington, as near Seattle. No, Bellingham, Washington is, if you will, the last stop before you're in Canada. It's about 90 miles from Seattle to Bellingham. That's like saying, well, Waco is a bedroom community of Dallas. It's about 90 miles from Dallas to Waco. But okay, I'll stop getting off my geography lesson here. This is where protesters broke into the city hall in Bellingham, Washington. They forced the mayor to actually have to be escorted out of the building for safety. The mayor, Seth Fleetwood, said it was impossible to ignore the parallels to the storming of the Washington, D.C. Capitol building on January 6th. You think he might be a Democrat? Oh, yeah. The storming of the Capitol is just identical to the Antifa, people that are actually threatening your life in Bellingham, Washington. Okay, well, we know how that goes. But nevertheless, here's the story. Protesters broke into a locked city hall in Bellingham today. Mayor had to be escorted out for safety. They also tore down an American flag. Sure, those are pro-Trump people, right? Don't you think so? Stole a microphone from the local media there and threw a hot drink on him. They were supposedly there advocating for the homeless. Whatever. And, of course, then there's another news report here. Just drove the City Hall. Protesters appear to have mostly cleared, maybe a few hanging around. Mayor says the violence today does not help those who are experiencing homelessness in any way. And so you're starting to see more and more of the rioting, which brings me finally to our second article today. And Bronson Stockton put it this way: Seattle sure waited a long time to implement this new policy on rioting. He says, as you recall, we had leftist rioting in Seattle for months last year. Rioters attacked cops, set fires, vandalized nearly everything in their path, even took over a neighborhood, declaring it to be an autonomous zone. Finally, in response to months, not days, not weeks, months of anarchy, the Seattle police then came under fire for treating the protesters too rough, and the Seattle's police chief finally resigned, and the mayor, Jenny Durkham, announced that she would not seek a second term. Well, after this, now you had about 600 rioters now that have been arrested since the mob's first form last spring, and so as a result, the interim police chief in Seattle said, okay, enough is enough. You think? Finally. And so this is just days after it says Joe Biden's inauguration, days after rioters destroyed property in Seattle, vandalized the Democratic Party office. Is that the tripping point? If you actually vandalize the federal buildings or vandalize a Starbucks, no problem. You vandalize a Democratic Party headquarters in Portland, Democratic Party headquarters in a few other places, then that's enough. And so now we are seeing all sorts of things from the actual interim police chief, who is actually putting together a stricter policy of enforcement, which has been also coordinated with the city attorney in Seattle, that'd be Pete Holmes. And under the new policy that took effect on Saturday, rioters arrested for misdemeanors are more likely to be charged by prosecutors. Again, recognize these are misdemeanors, okay? How far do you have to go before you actually get a stronger charge against you? And despite the chief saying he wanted a stricter policy months ago, it now appears, and again, appearance and reality different, but at the moment it appears that Seattle is now implementing it in a more significant way. So that's the second article, and some of you might say, why doesn't the police, why doesn't the district attorney, why don't some of these individuals use some kind of deterrence? And the answer is, it finally occurred on some of them that maybe that's indeed what they need to do. Well, after we come back from the break, I want to take on the first article here. This is a very long one, but I would encourage you to read it. It is written by Glenn Greenwald. Now, again, I'll try to help you understand. Glenn Greenwald describes himself as left of center, was very critical of some of the abuses of the war on terror, is not a fan of George W. Bush, certainly not a fan of Donald Trump. But nevertheless, as a liberal, I have appreciated his honesty. And this is a fairly lengthy one in which he talks about this new domestic war on terror, which has been implemented in partly and also talked about in saying, let's learn from 9/11. 9/11 was this war on terror Well, January 6th was our, if you will, Democratic 9/11. And so we're going to, if nothing else, take some of the lessons we learned from fighting Islamic terrorism on the battlefields, and let's now see if we can import those into our domestic soil against our fellow Americans. And it's not too hard to figure out who many of those in power, that would be the Democrats, identify as those individuals that are domestic terrorists. Antifa, BLM aren't on the list. But the 3%ers, white supremacists, Proud Boys, they're on the list. So we'll come back and talk about what that means right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I want to point your direction and maybe your attention to a very lengthy, and again, I'll warn you ahead of time, if you print this out, it looks like about, 10, maybe even 12 pages of material from Glenn Greenwald. And I like to quote from individuals who, in some respects, don't agree with us around the table, but come to similar conclusions. Because, if I'm quoting from somebody that is a supporter of Donald Trump, you go, well, I can just completely ignore that individual. And I have been appreciative of the few, and I do emphasize few, liberals that have been honest with the facts. And we've talked about some of those before. Where would we be without Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley? And another one is Glenn Greenwald. And this is called The New Domestic War on Terror, in which he's talked about the fact that here we go again. He says, in some respects, I've seen this before. Now, understand that he is an individual, I'm sure, would identify himself as a liberal, identify himself as a Democrat, as an individual that was very critical of some of the excesses that surfaced in the war on terror. And he's used some examples of that. I mean, after all, once we had to fight Islamic terrorism, we then had the authorization to use military force, and that has been responsible for 2 decades of war. You know, those wars that are maybe not winnable, these wars that never are concluded, never have an end to them, and those kinds of things. And even more so, something we talked about years ago, the Patriot Act, which vastly expanded government surveillance over you and me. And it was supposed to be temporary, and it was supposed to be sunset in 4 years, and it still exists. And as a matter of fact, you can read more about that in our booklet on privacy and security. So these are some issues that need to be addressed. If now, all of a sudden, as he points out, we're now starting to see this drumbeat for, just as we went after Islamic terrorists, now let's go after domestic terrorists, identified as this. And he said we've actually seen, he calls it an orgy of censorship from Silicon Valley monopolies, calls for far more aggressive speech policing, a visibly militarized Washington, D.C. featuring a non-ironically called green zone. If you don't understand that, the green zone was that which was around Baghdad during our war on terror. Vows from the incoming president and his allies for a new anti-domestic terrorism bill, and then frequent accusations, I should say, of sedition, treason, terrorism against members of Congress and citizens and all the rest. And by the way, again, he makes it clear in other things he's written that he really had strong reservations about the rally, about the attempts to challenge the Electoral College vote and all sorts of things. So he's hardly on that side, but he's just sort of horrified that all of a sudden people throwing around words like sedition, treason, terrorism, incitement to violence, and the rest. And he says, underlying all of these immediate insinuations that anyone questioning any of this must, by virtue of these doubts, harbor sympathy for the terrorists and their neo-Nazi white supremacist ideology. And he says, wait, liberals have spent so many years now in a tight alliance with neocons and the CIA. They're making, with the 2002 version of John Ashcroft, look like he was the president of the ACLU. You got to recognize that there was a tendency for many Republicans and even conservatives to say, you know, we don't have any problem at all of giving these kinds of police powers to the Attorney General at the time. That was John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General under George W. Bush. Because, hey, we like him. Matter of fact, we've interviewed him on this program before. A fine, outstanding individual. But what I said at the time, and Marlon Maddox, I think, said at the time, and Penna Dexter said at the time, you may not always have somebody like John Ashcroft in the Attorney General's office. You think? And, of course, we didn't. And then you started having everything from the IRS to the FBI and the CIA doing some things that people didn't really like. And here, again, he's talking about those individuals saying they're calling for a 9/11 commission and all of the rest. And I think it's just illustrative of the fact that, if nothing else, he raises some really important questions. One of those questions, he said, is why would we need a new terrorism law or new terrorism laws in a country that already imprisons more of its citizens than nearly every other country in the world? And then he asked, what kind of acts would be criminalized under this new domestic terrorism law or laws? Oh, I think we can assume that those would be criminalizing any kind of action, behavior, or even thought that was something that the party in power dislikes. And that might be what? The Democratic Party. And, of course, the justification for all of this is the riot or the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And again, can we bring some common sense to this conversation? I've said this before, but it needs to be said almost every hour. And that is, if you attack a police officer, you go to jail. And it doesn't matter whether you're carrying a Trump flag or an Antifa flag. Doesn't matter if you're wearing the red, white, and blue on your uniform, you're wearing black. You go to jail. That's simple enough. It doesn't matter whether it's left or right. And this attempt to turn a blind eye to some of the actions of Antifa and even some of the more radical BLM is no more justifiable than some trying to rewrite the history of what actually happened on January 6th by some conservatives. And if you trespass on federal property, and that is happening a lot more now. I mean, I'm talking about not just a federal courthouse in Portland, but a variety of other venues, like the ICE headquarters in Portland and in Seattle and the rest, or whether it's the Capitol in Washington. Again, you go to jail. And so I think it is important to recognize that we don't really need new terrorist laws. We need to enforce the ones that we have, and cannot be used as an excuse to go after a group which I know will be expanded far beyond the people that actually perpetuated and even instituted and even planned some of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that one of the other articles I've posted, and we'll talk about this in the third hour, was the decision by incoming President Joe Biden to actually disband the 1776 Commission. That was something that was actually put together under the Trump administration, and it issued its report just the other day in which it called for the principles of American founding and also talked about how those principles have shaped our country. And yet within a few hours in the office, President Joe Biden actually disbanded the commission with an executive order. Now, again, compared to his executive orders that killed the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to talk about that more in the next hour and what that could end up killing, as one of my articles say, 1 million new jobs. Or whether it is the stopping the construction of the wall. Many people think that might lose 50,000 jobs or something like that. Or even the idea of promoting transgenderism. I recognize this may be kind of small potatoes, but the point is, it tells you a lot about how this president and his administration views the founding of this country, because then it seems like they're throwing their weight in with the New York Times 1619 Project, which we've talked about here before, which says that America was founded on slavery, and actually the American Revolution was fought primarily to perpetuate the institution of slavery. Well, you got some great articles here, but the other day I posted one by Victor Davis Hanson, who was on the commission himself, who said that in any other time or age, this report would not have been controversial. It was unanimously approved by a group of historians and lawyers and academics and scholars and authors and public servants, but this is not a typical year, and here again you see that most of the time people would look at this report and say it's not controversial, and no president would ever have thought of actually dissolving the commission. But I think it illustrates again that with an executive order, President Joe Biden ended that, so it had one report and then it was disbanded. And that's a sad commentary because it maybe shows you the direction of where the teaching of history is going in America. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Winsome Conviction by the authors that wrote the previous book, Winsome Persuasion, I should say. And we'll talk about disagreeing without dividing the church. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about division, not just in the world, but also sometimes within the church. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've had David French on talking about Divided We Fall and talk about some of the polarized nature of this country and various tribes, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Justin Gaboni has been on when we've talked about this idea of civic engagement in his book, Compassion and Conviction. But this division isn't just between left and right, Christian and non-Christian. It oftentimes is within the church. And so I thought that this subbook that we will be talking about this hour might be very helpful. Winsome Conviction, Disagreeing Without Dividing the Church. Now, the two authors are probably going to be familiar to you because you might have heard of their previous book. Came out a couple of years ago, Winsome Persuasion, Christian Influence in a Post-Christian World. It was actually selected as Book of the Year in the Apologetics Evangelism section from Christianity Today. And so they've been thinking about certainly how Christians are perceived in the world. But now we're going to talk about what about the divisions inside the church? And that is illustrated by the number of individuals we've had in this studio who would disagree with each other on issues like Donald Trump, immigration, and a variety of others. We're not talking about the disagreements maybe between the non-Christian world and the world about, say, abortion or homosexuality, but sometimes there is sort of intramural, and can I maybe even use the New Testament term quarreling that needs to be addressed. So that's one of the reasons we're going to spend some time talking about this book. If you'd like to know more about the book, we have information about it on the website, and of course you can order it there. Of course, I hope you would find it in your local bookstore. First of all, I want to bring to the microphone Dr. Tim Muehlhoff, who is a professor at Biola, a professor of communication, has his PhD from the University of North Carolina. He, along with Richard Langer, who we'll talk about in just a minute, of course, have co-authored this particular book that I mentioned before, Winsome Persuasion, and now this one, Winsome Conviction, and actually is one of the co-directors of the Winsome Conviction Project, trying to introduce civility and compassion into the discussion. So, Dr. Tim, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having us back.
And Dr. Richard Langer, I already sort of alluded to him as well, professor of biblical and theological studies, which would be at Talbot School of Theology. Also an individual that was the co-author not only of Winsome Persuasion, but this one, Winsome Conviction. Might also mention that has a lot of experience in the ministry because he was not only a missionary with Campus Crusade for Christ, but also an associate pastor at Trinity Evangelical Free. And Dr. Richard, thank you for joining us as well.
Hey, thanks so much for having us, Kerby.
Let's, if I can, lead out with one of you to talk about how this came to be, because you both talk about early on in the book your own individual journeys. Maybe, Tim, let's talk about that for just a minute, because in some respects, we've talked about Campus Crusade with Rick, but we should talk about it with you as well, because in some respects you've looked at it both in the para-church organization and even in the church organization, haven't you?
Yeah, I was on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ as well, and I did all my grad work at a secular university, an MA and a PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, loved it, but was the most conservative person in the room by a mile,
yes,
both religiously and politically. And of course I wanted to reach individuals within my department and even within my school, but disagreed with fellow crew members how to do that. I remember distinctly one person coming up to me and saying, I want to put the first chapter of Mere Christianity in the mailbox of every grad student in your entire department, and will you give me permission to do that? And I said, no. And he was like, why? I said, listen, no one's going to read it, and you don't have any credibility in this department, and nobody's ready for C.S. Lewis. I mean, we need to think more deeply about an insider perspective, and Kerby got really mad at me. He said, you're anti-evangelism. I said, I am not anti-evangelism, but what you're talking about is proselytizing. I'm talking about evangelizing. And so here's two people, same goal, love the Lord, want to see people introduced to the gospel, but we couldn't disagree more about how do you actually have fruitful spiritual discussions that could lead to presenting the gospel. That's what this book is about, is what happens when Christians care deeply about traditional marriage, about pro-life issues, but how they want to do it seems antithetical to each other, and they find themselves on opposite sides of a chasm and opposite sides of the church, because I don't even want to be around you anymore because of the way you want to do something.
Rick, let me come to you because you were directing, I think, a small group ministry at your church, and that takes us all the way back to 1992. And since I'm the old guy around the table, I remember those years, and some of our younger listeners maybe not, but we're talking about George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. And you ran into some interesting experiences too, didn't you?
Yeah, I sure did. I was leading the small group ministries to say, and this is one of the first times it really dawned on me how profound and deep some of these issues are within our local churches. And I was, I think one of the stories I tell in the book was leading a small group leaders meeting, and we were having a discussion about how we're going to be, dealing with things in the next few weeks. And the election had just come up, and Bill Clinton won, Bush had lost, and one of the group leaders was suggesting we should have a time of lament and mourning in our small groups to kind of open our small group prayer time or whatever that way. And, so I kind of took a pause at that moment. I wasn't a Bill Clinton supporter, but I was aware of the fact that on average, the average, American evangelical church is basically 4-1 Republicans over Democrats, which is a pretty overwhelming majority in, our political landscape. But the interesting thing is that means if you have a small group of like 12 people, that means you probably have 2 or 3 Democrats in the group. And so I just asked my leaders, well, why don't you just pull out a 3x5 card and write down the names of the 2 or 3 people in your group who you think are Democrats? And there was like this dead silence. And finally somebody asked me, well, I don't think any are. And so I talked about just the statistics and said, the odds would be that there really are, but you don't know them because they haven't felt like they could even raise their viewpoint on these issues. And how do you think they'd feel if we just had a scheduled season of lament? So it was a really interesting moment, and we had a good discussion about it. But I think it's one of those areas where you get a certain number of people, a critical mass, and then you completely become oblivious to the viewpoints of other people who might be sitting right there beside you in a small group experience. So these are the challenges we face within the church.
And again, we talked about that a little bit with certainly David French in terms of the fact that the more you get around your tribe and you only hear positive things, then it drives you to the extremes. So going to take a break and want to come back. Your second chapter about the forgotten middle ground is something I even have written about in the past and wrote about again last week, because a lot of people have talked about this idea of hidden tribes of America, in which if you start figuring it out, there's a lot of people that fit into what's called the exhausted majority, or what you call the forgotten middle ground. So we'll take a break and talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will the federal government move to regulate big tech? I think that is unlikely for many reasons I will delineate in a moment, but I can't deny that there is growing concern about censorship on various social media platforms. It started with disclaimers on social media posts and is now expanded to banning politicians and commentators, and even an attempt to destroy an alternative social media platform. House Intelligence Committee ranking member Devin Nunes called for a RICO investigation of big tech. Here's a simple test. If no investigation takes place in the next month or so, then you can assume that there will be no regulation of big tech. The common argument is that these social media organizations are private companies and therefore should not be governed by First Amendment protections against censorship. The authors of a Wall Street Journal op-ed argue that these companies should be treated as state actors under existing legal doctrines. The Supreme Court has ruled that government cannot encourage private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. They argue that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunizes them from liability, does that. Although Donald Trump and a number of members of Congress called for a repeal of Section 230, I doubt that that will happen under this administration that is already showing itself to favor Silicon Valley and the influence of big tech. Even if someday Congress were to remove those protections, I think it is likely that these huge companies would probably withstand any court challenge. Big tech has become the social media leviathan with unchecked power to ban people from their platforms and censor content. But I don't see much courage on the part of the new administration or Congress to challenge its actions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Drs. Tim Muehlhoff and Richard Langer, and they are the authors of the previous book, Winsome Persuasion. But this one we're talking about Winsome Conviction, Disagreeing Without Dividing the Church. And I wanted to focus, Tim and Richard, on Chapter 2 in terms of the middle ground, because we've talked about this before in a number of different venues and situations in which a lot of what is discussed and even promoted either comes from one very extreme side, the progressive activists, or the other side called devotive conservatives. And so in some respects, that maybe makes up, about 14%. They're the most visible. They're oftentimes the best funded. They're the ones that show up on the various cable news shows arguing with one another. What that leaves is about 86% in the middle. A lot of us that are going, we're the forgotten middle ground. So I wanted to get into that, first of all, to talk about that middle ground. And then I so appreciate this chapter because you do something I do in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, where I take us to Romans 14, because there have been some times where Christians may honestly disagree, but it's not over a real black and white issue. And Romans 14 has to do with meat sacrificed to idols, but I think it applies a lot to the political issue. So, Tim, let me come to you for just a minute, and then I'll come to Richard about this idea of middle ground, because you really say that a lot of even our listeners here at Point of View are part of that forgotten middle ground, aren't they?
Well, I really feel that way. I feel like I'm part of this middle group that has, nuanced views about certain issues. And so we have to make sure, Kerby, that the small groups we belong to, we have to make sure that they haven't become like echo chambers where only one perspective is being presented. And the person who leads the group comes from a certain perspective and poo-poos any attempt to share an alternative perspective. And I think a lot of us just start to realize over time, I don't know anybody. I don't know anybody from different points of view. Rick and I just took part in a wonderful project the other day. It was Saturday, From All Sides, did a national Meet Your Political Opposite Day. So you did the survey, you signed up, and I actually met a woman who is my political opposite, and we had a great hour-long conversation, but we both lamented that we don't know people from the other camp, and that this was so refreshing. So, Kerby, we're going to have to find ways to make sure that our small groups are, in fact, a representation of the diverse middle ground and not just the extreme left or the extreme right, and that middle ground is going to have differences of opinion. And that's what Rick does a great job of, is how Paul handles when Jewish and Gentile believers are trying to come together. He wants to create that place that they can have some good conversations with each other but still disagree.
Let's talk, if we can, Richard, about that idea, because in some respects we do talk about civility here. It's one of the sections in my book, and it's something we've done booklets on here at Point of View. So how do we create that? Because sadly, we're trying to create that within the Christian world, but there's pretty good evidence from Jonathan Haidt and all sorts of other studies that show that actually, if anybody lives in a bubble, it's oftentimes are the people on the left, because they do live in their bubble. Even those of us who are Christians, we have to go to universities like you individuals did at University of California at Riverside, University of North Carolina. When we open up the New York Times, the Washington Post, we're not necessarily getting a viewpoint from Christianity today. So we certainly can be living in bubbles, but the other side lives in even a more bubble, and we need to figure out some ways to reach across the aisles or reach across that chasm, isn't it? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, we really do. And I think we, as we've mentioned, we are in a place where we commonly, as Christians, we do encounter what you might call the other side. Tim was mentioning his graduate program. I did my graduate program in philosophy and actually did my dissertation on right to privacy and right to life. So I was, basically writing a pro-life dissertation at large secular university. So, you realize, man, I've got to be thoughtful about how I communicate this, because obviously people aren't going to be sharing my assumptions. So, we get trained in, just by default, the funny side effect of that is I think we often view the church as our refuge. We go out into the world and we bump into all these people who disagree with us. So we come back to the church, and I think our tacit hope is that all of the people will agree with me there about it.
And they don't, yes.
And they don't. I don't know. They didn't get the memo. I don't know how it happened, but
yes.
And so it becomes really hard, and you feel, kind of the sense of shock or betrayal when the guy in the small group sitting beside says, well, I actually voted for, Joe Biden, or, whatever the issue may be, or Donald Trump, or, whoever your least favorite person is, suddenly realize, oh my gosh. And so this is one of the things that we talk about with the Romans 14 framework. And I think we have a danger of hearing that it's kind of days and diets, so are there special days? Are there dietary restrictions? That obviously echoes the Jewish law. And we tend to think about that as trivial issues. Well, what you eat and the day you worship may be trivial for us today, but it was anything but trivial to a early church in the Greco-Roman world that had a mixed congregation of Jewish and Gentile believers. I mean, this was a huge issue, and for the Jewish believers, this was the hallmark of your identity as a covenant person. And the person sitting beside you in church wants to disown that. And of course, you believe in Jesus, but he's the fulfillment of all the covenant promises, right? So what's this guy doing, not caring about this, trivializing it? And so that's the world in which Paul was speaking. And his recommendation to them, interesting enough, is not to say, who cares? It's not to say, don't form a conviction, but rather to form an absolute conviction that everyone would stand up and recite together at the beginning of a service. He says, I want you to form a personal conviction. But I want it to be a conviction because you're going to stand before Jesus to give an account of it. He says in Romans, I think it's 14:12, where he says basically you'll stand to give an account. So your brother doesn't need to judge you on this, but realize Jesus really will. And Paul says, I want you to be fully convinced in your own mind. Whatever doesn't proceed from faith is sin. And he really hammers the notion of making it a conviction. But I want you to hold it personally and before Jesus. You do this to honor Jesus with your life, and you don't need to export it to the person sitting beside you in the pew.
Well, let's, for either of you, talk about what you identify as the spectrum of conviction, because there are certain timeless truths, and those are the we believe statements, and many of us actually in front of church members talk about those basically non-negotiables. But then there are all sorts of other things where we may have a personal conviction, but that's a place where, in some respects, the scriptures allow us to agree to disagree. Can we sort of sort that out for just a minute?
Sure. If you were just going to have some things he wants to add in on that as well, but the conviction spectrum, we kind of put that together just to help people kind of think about what's really going on in our minds as we think about this stuff. Because as I mentioned, we have absolute convictions that we say, if a person's denying the deity of Christ, you're like, well, gee, that's incompatible with the Christian faith. These are things we put in our confession, so they're things you might call an absolute conviction. And usually with our confessions, these are theological statements. We might call them a confessional belief. If you confess that belief, you are a Christian. If you deny it, you're not. It's like, okay, then. And, of course, we have those. And, we absolutely affirm the importance of those. And probably close beside them, you have things that aren't conceptual beliefs, but there's such explicit commands of Scripture that they also are the things that you would expect. If a person denied that, it's somehow incompatible with the Christian faith. So, failing to honor, hey, it's okay to commit adultery or murder or something like that. You go, well, wait a minute, that just doesn't work. Or even to say, I've done this whole love your neighbor thing for weeks and weeks now, and I'm really tired. I've decided I'm just not going to buy in.
Yes.
And you're like, well, that's not really an option either.
No.
So there's kind of those things on one end. But the interesting thing is, well, what does it mean to love your neighbor? Does that mean to care for them by providing food? No, I think the most important thing is create a structure where they can provide their own food. And you begin to realize that common belief begins to diverge, where some people are more concerned with immediate social action. Others think the best way to deal with poverty is immediate economic action and economic structures. And at the end of the day, someone ends up actually getting down to the point where they vote for a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate based on their priority of economic versus, kind of personal relief and social safety net structures for dealing with poverty. You begin with a common faith, but you end up with diverse action points.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into this whole idea of unity, because there's been, of course, talk in the political realm about unity, but there's supposed to be unity within the body of Christ, and how do we make that happen? And it's not like we haven't had to think about this before in the church. You had Jews and Gentiles, you had individuals that came from all sorts of different experiences, and yet the goal is unity within the body of Christ. So we're going to talk about what that means as we continue our conversation of the book, Winsome Conviction, right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that the book is about 200 pages, published by InterVarsity Press, came out in December, so it would be very easy for you to probably find in a local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. But more importantly, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to the Winsome Conviction project, Deepening Convictions Without Dividing Communities. And I thought for just a minute, Tim and Richard, let's, if we can, talk about how people can use not only the book, but the resources that you have there, because you have a blog that continues on. People can go to, of course, biola.edu and find it, but we also have it on our website. And I know that we have a number of listeners that are pastors or Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and others who could actually begin to lead a discussion on this. So can either of you maybe give us a little bit of an idea of what resources might be available? The book is a good start, but I think you have some other things that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. If you go to our website, winsomeconviction.com, you will find videos. We do a great interview with Richard Muehlhoff, former president of Fuller, about civility. We do book reviews. We have our podcast is there, the Winsome Conviction podcast. So, yeah, check it out. And there's a bunch of links to Zoom conferences that we're doing. We're going to do a huge conference on online civility and the need to reclaim the electronic public square and do it in a way that we can speak truth with love. But let me mention the podcast real quick, Kerby, because this brings up an interesting point that you were making. So when we're doing this podcast, we had this vision, let's bring on people who disagree with us. Let's bring on Christians and non-Christians who disagree with us. So Rick talked about that confessional belief. Well, what if we brought on Christians who maybe be questioning that confessional belief? Here's the response we've gotten, so interesting. Why would you give the microphone to people like that? Why would you give a platform to a person who's questioning the deity of Christ? Or why would you give a Muslim the microphone, or give a person who's pro-choice instead of being pro-life? So what we need to get away from in today's argument culture is this idea that acknowledgement is the same as condoning. That acknowledging a person's perspective means that I'm condoning that perspective. And so it's interesting that our podcast has run into trouble because people's attitudes are like, no, why invite that person on your program? And our answer is because we want to engage in a civil way, that we both get to the issues, but do it in a way that we're speaking truth and love.
You know, it is interesting because if you do that in apologetics, by the way, if you think you get emails, imagine broadcasting to more than 1 million people, okay? But when we've done that before, we have atheists and because we've had some atheists in the studio here a few times, most people go, okay, I understand that, because if nothing else, I want to hear how you're going to respond to them. And when I sometimes talk about some of the issues in the news, whether it's the issue of voter fraud or whether it's the issue of immigration, I'll say, now this is what some people will say, or I will give you a quote from that. Most people say, that's pretty good. But when it gets too close to inside the walls of the church, that's when, of course, you get probably more of those reactions. But if you think about it, what you want to do is help people know how to respond to evil or error. It could be theological error. It could be calling for some really evil policies. And what would you say to individuals? So sometimes we're appreciative of a little bit of that voice. But you're right. If you give too much what looks like a platform, then, well, of course, I know what the emails look like because I get lots of them. Let's, if we can, maybe, though, again, mention that we have a link to Winsome Conviction. I think we have a link to the blogs, and of course people can find their other material. I will also have a link to both of your websites so that people can find you, and maybe a shout out to any student thinking about wanting to maybe study from a Christian point of view. I hope that you'll think about Biola University, and if you are really wanting to maybe study theology or apologetics, Talbot would be a great place to go. But let's talk about unity within the church, because I love how you start this one chapter. You can buy one for $38.99, and you can get it next day from Amazon Prime. It's a portable smoke machine. Comes with LED lights and a wireless remote control. And in minutes, you can fill the auditorium with a fine mist. And of course, we all know that there have been church splits over things like whether you have drums in the orchestra or whether you have individuals up there with tattered jeans. all the way back to which version of the Bible should be quoted from the pulpit. So when we talk about unity, we've had problems with unity within the church long before the political issues ever surfaced and actually began to circulate around the congregation, haven't we?
Well, let me jump in, Rick, and talk about the smoke machine, and then you can jump in and talk about maybe how Paul tried to wrestle with this. So that is a real situation. That actually
I was sure
happened.
it was.
This is a dynamic church, and they really got angry over this issue. Because here's what happened. C.S. Lewis talks about the hallway of faith, right? This is what Rick said. These are the confessional beliefs that you have to believe to be a Christian. But then you got rooms off the hallway. Now, I would argue that having a smoke machine to give, ambiance to the auditorium, to invite even insiders in for like a contemporary worship service, clearly that's a room off the hallway to me, right? Nobody's happy, Kerby, with my issue being a room off the hallway. Like, nobody likes that. So I got to get my issue into the hallway because that's checkmate. If I can show you here's what the issue is over. Not the smoke machine, but should the church be worldly?
Yeah.
Because if the smoke machine is worldliness, checkmate. Who can argue for that negative influence seeping into the church? So that's almost what sunk the church. Otherwise, you could simply say, fine, the 9 o'clock service is traditional. The 11:30 service is with the smoke machine. It's contemporary, live and let live. Nobody wanted to do that. And so one group said, you're being worldly, and we're fighting against that.
Yeah. And so, again, that's the kind of division. And, Rick, let me come to you because that's, again, how do we resolve this? Because it takes us back to, I think, Romans 14, doesn't it? But how would you deal with that? You've been a pastor, so you've certainly had to think about these issues.
Yeah, these come up a lot. And Tim, basically, as he was giving that description, are we talking about a smoke machine, or are we talking about Christians being worldly? One of them seems debatable. One of them seems like non-debatable. And that move is made very commonly. So Tim and I decided to baptize it. We decided to give it a name, and we call that weaponizing our belief. So I have a belief about smoke machines. I find them extremely distasteful. And by the way, it'd be really nice if the guy who was, smoking that smoke machine wouldn't be standing there in tattered jeans. And so you have a certain disposition about that, and you work it up across that conviction spectrum, and you move it up to something that is, in this case, kind of a moral mandate that Christians shouldn't be worldly. And that's probably part about more of a confessional belief that we should be in the world, not of the world, and, batch of things about being a peculiar people and a distinctive, chosen people of God. So you realize, wow, you ramp it up to the confessional belief, which is actually fine. That's exactly what I would want everybody to do when you're trying to figure out, how do I feel about this with worship? But here's the tricky thing. Once you've done that, then you begin to equate your belief with the confessional belief that you drew it from. So if anyone disagrees with you, they disagree with being, about being worldly. If you draw your beliefs about gender roles from the Trinity, if you disagree with me about gender roles, you're disagreeing with me about the Trinity, and you weaponize the belief that way because you shift it from an area where you can immediately see the room for possible disagreement, but because you derived it from a place where there is no disagreement, you think it is the thing where there's no disagreement. And that's what just isn't true. We've got to that's why we put that spectrum there, to help people realize we do attach them to our confessional beliefs, but we can't equate them with our confessional beliefs.
Well said.
That's hard to convince people of.
Let me take a break because we have one of those mandatory breaks. And when we come back, again, just a lot of great insights in here. But one other I thought we at least want to put on the table when we come back from the break is conviction mapping. And that is not to necessarily change convictions, but at least try to understand that. So the idea of conviction mapping gets into maybe clarifying what your convictions are, some of the history of that as well, the context, and much more. There is no way, of
of course, that we can cover all of the material in a 200-page book by two authors that have been thinking about this for some time, but we wanted to at least give you kind of an introduction to it, and at the same time suggest that perhaps you want to find out more about the work that they're doing in terms of this Winsome Conviction project, and so we also have that information. If you're interested in the book, of course, as I pointed out, it is published by InterVarsity Press. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've given you an opportunity to get it both in paperback and Kindle. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with our two authors right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Tim and Richard with us. Again, we have this book, which we would certainly commend to you, Winsome Conviction, Disagreeing Without Dividing the Church. And, of course, that is one of the themes in their Winsome Conviction project, and you can find out more about that on the website. But, Tim and Rick, just for a minute, let's talk about this idea of conviction mapping, because you're not saying that, well, I'm going to map it out and exclude you. We're not necessarily trying to necessarily change your conviction or someone else's, but it's really an attempt to try to think through the issues. And I know you've devoted an entire chapter. It's unfair to ask you to try to summarize it in a few minutes, but can you do the best? Because that's, I think, one of the action items that I took out of your book.
So I'll start with a quote and then hand it off to Rick to lay out the details. This was prompted by the Harvard Negotiation Project, one of the top mediator groups in our country. They have a great quote, Kerby. The quote is, the biggest mistake, and when the Harvard Negotiation Project says the biggest mistake, you really listen. They say the biggest mistake is we trade conclusions with each other without sharing how we arrived at the conclusion.
Good line.
And I think that's the argument culture today. So conviction mapping is me just trying to start from the beginning, asking questions like, when did you start to feel this way? When did you start to think this way? What have you read that has really shaped your perspective? Who are the people that have helped you think through this issue? So it's trying to understand how you became a Democrat, a Republican, why you left the church, why you believe this issue is a confessional belief and not a room off the hallway. You know, the book of Proverbs says that it's folly and shame to speak before listening. Mm-hmm. And so conviction mapping is a form of listening where I really want to hear your journey. And so, Rick, why don't you jump in, because Rick helped shape that chapter.
Yeah, one of the things that Tim pointed out there, the idea of exchanging conclusions without telling the story, in effect, if you're saying, hey, we're going to have a talk about our conflicting and differing convictions, so let's share our difference, and then we're going to have a debate about it. You end up exchanging propositions and arguments. The conviction, what we call conviction thickening, what part of conviction mapping is thickening the conviction, which is what Tim was talking about, telling your story. And it's really interesting how immediately it changes the tenor of a conversation. We did a thing on campus with two faculty members who disagreed. We called them a duologue, and so picked some particular issue, and they talked about, you know, how they came to form those well-formed, what we thought were well-formed Christian convictions, but were different. Well, we did preliminary work by having them come over to the house. We had, you know, dinner. This is back in the days when you'd have people over the house and have dinner without masks or anything else. And, you know, you would hear each other's backstory, and it was fascinating. And you're suddenly realizing, oh, this person grew up in a home where a dad left the family. Suddenly you went from being, you know, upper middle class to being on welfare, and you really appreciate the social safety net. And I did never have that experience growing up. So I know all that stuff from afar, but this person knows it intimately, personally. And it may not, that isn't an argument for which way is right, but my gosh, when you're talking to the person, it is so wonderful to realize, oh, that's part of why they feel that way. And Tim and I tell a few stories from our own life about, you know, Tim's attitude towards trade unions is conditioned by growing up in a family that. My dad was a guy who came over on the boat without, you know, regular immigration opportunity because he was fleeing Nazi Germany. And I have certain attitudes towards immigrants because of that. So it isn't an argument, but it's so helpful in understanding where a person's coming from. So that's a big part of the conviction mapping, is telling the backstory, sharing the narratives. And it's kind of an interesting relational invitation. You end up forming friendships instead of forming better or worse arguments. So it's a great, you know, approach for dealing with these kinds of different words for theological, political, whatever. Tell me the story of how you got to that point. It's a great technique.
Let's, if we can, come back to you, Tim, and then Richard as well. I'll get your comments on how people can use this book and use what they will find in terms of the blog, the podcast, and some of the other resources at the Winsome Conviction Project, because I think a lot of people say, yes, we have some divisions here. I have individuals in my Christian Action Committee that want us to be more political. I have other people that think this is ridiculous. And I've got a real tension in my church right now about how people feel about the previous election and going forward, what we're to do in the future. And we have tension about racial reconciliation and critical race theory and white fragility. We've got all these issues. How do I try to bring the body of Christ together? Can you give us some ideas?
Well, I would say it helps to read a book, be it ours or whatever, because it kind of gives you distance. You're talking about the book. You're not talking necessarily about your own situation. So we have a chapter on groupthink. Has your small group just become an echo chamber where all you do is affirm each other's beliefs and nothing ever gets challenged? And then we actually give the top 5 symptoms of that, and then give like 5 responses to groupthink. So it kind of takes the tension off if your small group is reading the chapter and then stop and say, now, wait a minute. All right, let's look at these 5 symptoms and apply it to our small group. It could be a nice conversation starter.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to have a devotional on our website. It's going to come out in mid-February, where you can actually go through a 7-day devotional looking at Scripture and key parts of the book that you could do as a church or do as a small group.
So again, some great opportunities there. Rick?
One of the things I've done with our faculty is a small group we just called Can't We Just Talk About It? And so we intentionally said, look, it's hard to talk about these things. We're going to get a batch of people together, and we'll identify some issues we disagree on, and then we'll tackle them kind of one at a time. And so we've done some really fun things with that. So we were like, the group we had was divided right down the middle about health care reform. And so we said, okay, great. We're going to talk about this one, and we're going to get all the people who are in favor of it they get 20 minutes to kind of talk first, and the other group will just listen to them talk. And their job is to take notes about what they learned, not to come up with counter-arguments, but just take notes. Then you flip it around, and the second group starts talking, and they talk to each other. And then we share what did we learn about the other side. So it's basically an exercise of listening to other people, understanding. And then we have some time to say, here's one question that brought to my mind. And so it takes, you need to kind of moderate those conversations, but it's interesting if you give a good structure, and Tim and I have used 3 or 4 different kinds of approaches to doing this, all of which can work great. It's amazing how often you can have very good conversations about difficult structures. The biggest concern is keeping your hand on the steering wheel, so having somebody who's tending the direction.
I understand that. Well, again, the book is entitled Winsome Conviction, and it is out, and I think it would be a book that you might want to use. I think you would like to know more about the Winsome Conviction Project, and it's all about disagreeing without dividing the church. We did mention this idea of groupthink and a number of other things that you will find there. A great historical postlude that I didn't have a chance to get into, but 200 pages of great wisdom and insight as you are trying to bring unity within your own particular sphere of influence, especially within the church. And so, Tim and Richard, it has been great to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby.
Hey, thanks so much for having us, Kirby. It was great.
We are going to take a break, but let me just mention again that when we talk about what is happening, some of the dialogues even within the church, I just thought that this book might be very helpful to you. And we recognize that when we try to communicate our biblical views out to the public square, of course, we're going to face conflict. But I think what we're also starting to see, and this is one of the reasons why we thought this would be an appropriate time to talk about this, there's conflicts within the church as well. And so is there a way that we can disagree without dividing the church? I think so. And certainly this is a very significant resource in that regard. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Monday edition here of Point of View. I hope you had a great weekend, but we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. You will notice that our first article here is called "The New Domestic War on Terror is Coming." This comes from Glenn Greenwald. We're going to get to that in just a minute. And one of the reasons I appreciate him is nobody can accuse him of being pro-Trump. Just the opposite. He was very much against some of the things of Donald Trump. Calls himself a left-of-center liberal, has a legal background, also a journalistic background, and is very concerned about what kind of comments are being made right now. Some of the statements, pronouncements calling for a domestic war on terror. And his argument is a very good argument that we already went through this war on terror for Islamic terrorism, and it did not turn out so well. And the call for having a 9/11 type of commission, reminiscent of what happened in 2002 with the 9/11 Commission, and then trying to maybe take all of the principles we learned from fighting Islamic terrorism and now using that against our fellow Americans. This will not end well. So he is probably so good to address those issues, and that is the first article we will talk about. Second article we'll get to is Seattle finally has a new policy on rioting. After all these months, and it isn't just because of what happened in Seattle, but also the ongoing rioting that's taking place in Portland. And if you're just hearing about that right now, that illustrates again how, in some cases, the mainstream media decides what you can learn about or not learn about. We'll get into a question about the vaccine rollouts, which has been a big issue, and I want to try to address that. Also, a piece on the new energy policy, how that might kill 1 million jobs. There are some that have said, if indeed you're concerned about the jobs in America, with a couple of executive orders, let's take one, getting rid of the Keystone XL pipeline. That gets rid of, now some are saying 11,000 jobs. There's now some fact checks saying, well, that might be too extreme. But even if it's half, as some people are suggesting, that's still a lot of jobs. Then I saw something the other day where they're talking about 50,000 jobs. And what are they talking about? Well, that has to do with no longer constructing the wall in our southern border. Okay, so there's a few. And then with the new energy policy, could affect up to 1 million jobs. That's pretty significant. And so those come from those executive orders. And before we end this hour, I also want to talk about the executive order actually disbanding the 1776 Commission, which I will admit is not as big as some of the other things I just mentioned. One's closing down the border, as well as the issue of new immigration policy, promoting transgenderism. Those are all our bigger issues. But it does, as nothing else, when you talk about disbanding a 1776 commission made up of a lot of individuals we've interviewed here on Point of View, it tells you something about what this president and his administration thinks about America and its founding. So we're going to get to that as well. So we have lots to cover, but let's, if we can, get to this first issue. Glenn Greenwald, if you're not familiar, is an individual that has been critical in the past of George W. Bush and the war on terror. And in some respects, he's saying, you know, I've seen this picture before and it doesn't end well, because now calling for new domestic police powers against terrorists. Those would be individuals that obviously stormed the Capitol on January 6th. could actually end up, in some respects, just the way the abuses of the War on Terror ended up about 20 years ago. And so he says the last 2 weeks have ushered in a wave of new domestic police powers and rhetoric in the name of fighting terrorism, which he says are really carbon copies of the worst excesses of the first War on Terror that began nearly 20 years ago. And of course, the reason for that is, of course, the riot or the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. He says we've witnessed an orgy of censorship from Silicon Valley, monopolies which call for far more aggressive speech policing, a visibly militarized Washington, D.C. featuring non-ironically named the Green Zone. If you're not familiar, the Green Zone was what was called around Baghdad in Iraq during the War on Terror. And the vows then from incoming president, of course now the president, and his key allies to a new anti-domestic terrorism bill and frequent accusations of sedition, treason, and terrorism against members of Congress and citizens. And he said this is all driven by a radical expansion of the meaning of incitement to violence, which I might get into today. If not, I'll postpone till tomorrow, which we might get into. And then a desire to actually work with the FBI to turn in one's fellow citizens, demand of a new system of domestic surveillance. And he says underlying all of these are immediate insinuations that anyone questioning any of this must, by virtue of these doubts, harbor sympathy for the terrorists, their neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology. And again, recognize that he's not one that necessarily would agree with the challenging of the vote of the Electoral College. He certainly was quite content to have Joe Biden elected and did not like Donald Trump. But it's sometimes helpful when liberals, who wouldn't necessarily always agree with some of the things that we say around the table, nevertheless points out that these are really kind of getting very dangerous very quick. And so what he has pointed out in the past is that there is a real desire now to have this 9/11 type of commission. And you heard that phrase used again and again and again in a lot of these different talk shows. And then we might learn some lessons from fighting Islamic terrorism that we could apply today here at home. Oh, sure. Let's just take some of the weapons we used on foreign battlefields against Muslim terrorists and radical Muslims and import them into the domestic soil here against our fellow Americans. But that's what's being proposed. And again, I got to appreciate Glenn Greenwald. I'm grateful for the Alan Dershowitzes and the Jonathan Turleys and the Glenn Greenwalds, who are liberals, but aren't just off the reservation in terms of common sense. And he points out that a lot of these abuses that we've seen today started because of this argument that we just need to fight Islamic terrorism. I didn't disagree with that, but I disagreed with some of the things that were implemented. And he points out, for example, that the whole authorization of the use of military force actually was rushed into acceptance and has been the justification for now 2 decades of wars that have taken place. The Patriot Act, which I've criticized before and actually critique in some detail in our booklet on privacy and surveillance, he says was radically expanding the government surveillance powers, and we've seen that as well. But it was enacted on the promise that it would be temporary and we would sunset it after 4 years. So then he sort of asks a very good question, which you can read in its entirety, of why we would need new terrorism laws in a country that already imprisons more of its citizens than nearly any other country in the world. And he says and asks, what acts should be criminalized under these new domestic terrorism laws? I think we can assume that what would be criminalized is anything that the party in power, that'd be the Democrats right now, dislikes. And so he's very concerned about that as well. Now, let's be honest. If you attack a police officer, you go to jail. I don't care if you're carrying a Trump flag or an Antifa flag. If you invade federal property, whether it's the Capitol of Washington or a federal courthouse in Portland, you go to jail. We'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will the federal government move to regulate big tech? I think that is unlikely for many reasons I will delineate in a moment, but I can't deny that there is growing concern about censorship on various social media platforms. It started with disclaimers on social media posts and is now expanded to banning politicians and commentators, and even an attempt to destroy an alternative social media platform. House Intelligence Committee ranking member Devin Nunes called for a RICO investigation of big tech. Here's a simple test. If no investigation takes place in the next month or so, then you can assume that there will be no regulation of big tech. The common argument is that these social media organizations are private companies and therefore should not be governed by First Amendment protections against censorship. The authors of a Wall Street Journal op-ed argue that these companies should be treated as state actors under existing legal doctrines. The Supreme Court has ruled that government cannot encourage private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. They argue that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunizes them from liability, does that. Although Donald Trump and a number of members of Congress called for a repeal of Section 230, I doubt that will happen under this administration that is already showing itself to favor Silicon Valley and the influence of big tech. Even if someday Congress were to remove those protections, I think it is likely that these huge companies would probably withstand any court challenge. Big tech has become the social media leviathan with unchecked power to ban people from their platforms and censor content. But I don't see much courage on the part of the new administration or Congress to challenge its actions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that is 1-800-351-1212. We have a new policy now coming out of Seattle, which I have posted, and you can read it. Seattle sure waited a long time to implement this new policy on rioting is the title of that second article we've posted. Then I want to get into some of the vaccine rollouts, talk about some of the job loss that is resulting now from some of these executive orders, what that might mean for you in the future. And before we're all through, spend a little bit of time maybe talking about America's godly heritage and our history and the disbanding of the 1776 Commission. Just a couple issues here. Let me just as a program note mention that Robert George will be with us tomorrow, and also we'll be talking with an individual that will be helping us on the other issues related to censorship and social media. That article that I have today, Regulate Big Tech, is one that we'll talk about, and Rachel Bovard will be with us as we talk about that, and then we'll get into some other news items as well. You know, you might have thought that after the election of Joe Biden and after the inauguration of Joe Biden that all the rioting would end, and you would be wrong. Let me try to give some history before we get to this one in Seattle, and that is to recognize that, okay, last Wednesday, that'd be January 20th, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were inaugurated, and so you have now the new president and vice president. And that night, guess what? Riots. I'll just read from this piece that comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. President Trump has left office, but peace and harmony have not descended upon the land. Left-wing rioters rampaged in the streets of Portland and Seattle on Wednesday, no matter Joe Biden's unity plea. They say, first of all, in Portland, rioters smashed the windows of the Democratic Party headquarters and scrawled graffiti on the Immigration and Customs Enforcement building. Demonstrators carried signs reading, "We are ungovernable. We don't want Biden. We want revenge for police murders, imperialist wars, fascist massacres, and all of the rest." Portland police say that some of the rioters carried pepper ball guns, electronic crowd control weapons such as tasers, large fireworks, shields, and rocks, and that weapons were seized that included Molotov cocktails, knives, batons, chemical spray, and a crowbar. And these would not necessarily fit under what CNN used to call largely peaceful protests. Well, let's go up to Seattle. In Seattle, protesters burned an American flag outside of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement office. This is all, by the way, last Wednesday. And rioters shattered windows at the federal William Kenzo Nakamura courthouse, an Amazon Go store, and the Pike Place Starbucks. Some chanted at the police, "We protect people, you protect property." And law enforcement arrested a couple of people for property damage. And rioters in both cities identified themselves either as anarchist or Antifa members who claimed to be protesting racism, fascism, and police brutality. Yet, in damaging a federal courthouse and Democratic headquarters, they attacked, as they said, the judiciary and Democratic institutions. Okay, so fast forward through the weekend. This is now Monday, and we're talking about what happened over the weekend. Let me just give you a little bit of a look at what happened Saturday night. This particular article, agents of the Federal Protective Services confronted crowds of rioters in Portland, Oregon. This was Saturday night, firing rounds of tear gas and non-lethal pepper balls at these protesters who were attacking the Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility. This Saturday night marked the fourth night in a row of rioting in Portland and the fourth night of federal response, a response that largely appears to have been fallen under the radar since the start of the Biden administration. You may actually be hearing about this for the very first time, and so that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover it here on Point of View. While we're talking about Seattle, let's go to the north. This one actually happens in Bellingham, Washington. Sometimes want to give a geography lesson to some journalists because they made it sound like Bellingham, Washington is like a bedroom community of Seattle. No, there's about 90 miles difference between Seattle and Bellingham. It's the kind of last stop on your way north to Vancouver, BC. So nevertheless, but in that case, protesters broke into the city hall in Bellingham, forced the mayor to be escorted, and they were banging on the door, and they had broken it open, were entering, and so they got him out as quickly as they possibly can. And supposedly in this case, were actually protesting homelessness. The mayor tried to say this was a parallel to the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. This is a group that tore down the American flag, stole a journalist's mic, threw a hot drink on him. I'm not thinking these are pro-Trump people. Pretty sure these are kind of Antifa, various kind of anarchists and all the rest. But nevertheless, this is something that took place up there in Bellingham. And so it led to the point I want to make now, which is our second article. And that is, after all of these months, we're not talking about days or weeks, we're talking about months of riots that have taken place in Seattle. Again, recognize that this was a group that attacked cops, set fires, vandalized just about everything in its path, took over a neighborhood and declared it an autonomous zone, led to the decision by the Seattle police chief to resign, led to the mayor of Seattle to announce that she was not going to seek a second term. All of this supposedly during that, what do we call that, summer of love? Well, okay, here's the rest of the story, which again, maybe the press will cover. I doubt that it will. About 600 rioters have indeed been arrested since that time. And now the Seattle interim police chief, that would be Adrian Diaz, now has announced that they are going to have a stricter policy of enforcement, in part because of the amount of property destroyed in Seattle and because of the destruction, or at least the vandalization, of the Democratic Party headquarters in Portland. I've often wondered if that's it. tear down a building, burn it up, set a car on fire. No. Take on the Democratic Party headquarters. Okay, you've crossed a line. Well, nevertheless, here's the announcement that now they will have a stricter policy enforcement, which they've coordinated with the Seattle City Attorney, that's Pete Holmes. Under this new policy that will now take effect, rioters arrested for misdemeanors will now be more likely to be charged. First of all, misdemeanors for some of the things these individuals have done. And if nothing else, there has been a desire for stricter policy. Now it seems like they are implementing it, and we'll see where that takes us in the next couple of days. So some of you have wondered, are we ever going to have deterrence? Well, maybe even Seattle has said enough is enough. Maybe they'll finally actually implement some deterrence. Just before I take a break, let me talk about the vaccine rollouts, because there's been a lot of criticism of those. And the biggest problem is not from what Donald Trump did or did not do, or what now incoming Joe Biden did or did not do. A lot of it has to do with the states. We have a federal system. We distribute the vaccines, and then the states and the localities are responsible. And so we are 6 weeks into those shipments. Okay, we've done this now for 6 weeks. And yet the United States has administered all of 53% of the vaccines that have been distributed. If you're having trouble getting hold of a vaccine, we get them into the states, but we can't get them into the arms of individuals. Now, the gap is pretty significant. Let's give some credit to our listeners up there in North Dakota. You're at 84%. How about our listeners in West Virginia? You're at 83%. And that's from a couple of days ago, so that percentage may be even closer to 90%. But we do have some that are at the bottom of the list. You would knew it would be California. 45%. Only 45% of the vaccines that have been distributed to the Golden State have actually made it into the arms of individuals. A close second is Alabama, 47%. And so I think it just illustrates again that if we're going to get these moving, we don't need, Team Biden to come and create some kind of federal mandate. Just get the vaccines there and then just encourage the states to do the right job. Of course, incoming President Joe Biden has said he wanted to actually have a goal of 100 million vaccines in 100 days. And I pointed out on Friday, but let's point it out again, that ends up being, 1 million vaccines distributed a day. And he said the previous administration did such a terrible job. Yeah, they averaged 939,000 vaccines administered every day, or almost 940. So his goal is to increase it by 60,000 of a million. I think we did okay in the past with certainly some of the things that we were trying to deal with in terms of Operation Warp Speed. And getting up to 1 million a day, great. Still going to take a long time to get out there, but nevertheless, that's a good illustration of that. And one other vaccine note, we have had at least one individual that has died getting the vaccine. That comes out of Placer County in California. Individual who already had tested positive for COVID-19, who then subsequently died after receiving the vaccine. The question we have to ask on any of these, as I did about the COVID listing as well, did individuals die of the COVID vaccine or with the COVID vaccine? It's a good question to ask, but nevertheless, that's the latest news on the vaccine front. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Before we get to a few more of the articles that I've posted here, I thought I might mention my Viewpoints commentary today, which is available to you. If you haven't signed up, you can get that receiving it in your inbox every single day, Monday through Friday. Penedexters comes on Saturday. Has the title Regulate Big Tech. My commentary tomorrow is about Big Tech Purge. And in some respects, this is a preview to the conversation we'll have about this time tomorrow with Rachel Bovard. She's been in studio with us before when she and former Senator Jim DeMint were around the round table talking about a book that she co-authored, and more recently has been on a number of programs talking about this issue of social media. And the real question that a lot of people have been asking is, will the federal government move to regulate big tech? I doubt it, but nevertheless, you can read my commentary today and see that. The argument has been that there has been a great deal of censorship in social media platforms, and it started, as we've pointed out before, with just some disclaimers about social media posts. Now is expanded to banning, as we know, politicians, commentators, even an attempt to destroy Parler as an alternative social media platform. So we'll talk about some of that with her tomorrow. I do point out that there is a call for an investigation, like a RICO investigation, but my test is that if you don't hear about an investigation in the next month or so, and I doubt we will, then you can pretty much assume there's going to be no regulation of big tech. Now, the argument that has been given in the past is that these are private companies. Don't disagree. Not at all. I mean, I recognize that is the case, that indeed these are individuals that are certainly making decisions about their own platforms. But is it a platform or a publisher? Because as you well know, if it's a publisher, then they have been really granted immunity, legal immunity, through what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And interestingly enough, there was a very good piece that I quote, so you can follow it, from two individuals who, writing in the Wall Street Journal, argue that these companies should be treated as state actors, because if you look at some of the various Supreme Court decisions, they say just because the say First Amendment keeps you from censoring individuals as the government, you can't then go and, if you will, job it out to someone else to do the censorship you wanted to do in the first place. And so that's kind of an argument. But I really sincerely doubt that Section 230 will indeed be redesigned or even removed, simply because we look at this administration, which is very favorable towards big tech and Silicon Valley. So I just don't think it's going to happen. Even if that were the case, I think these organizations are now so big they could withstand any kind of legal challenge. And so it illustrates, again, what we are dealing with here in the future. But just because those entities exist doesn't necessarily mean you need to use them. And I'm seeing more and more people that are looking for alternatives, or simply saying, you know what, maybe I'll just take a digital fast in the first place, just get off of them entirely. That will lead to some of the conversation we'll have tomorrow with Rachel Bovard, which is my commentary tomorrow. By the way, if you sign up, you can receive that at the start of the day, so you can read it even before we get in with her. And that is this attempt to purge more and more people off of social platforms. And that has become rather dramatic, because you had, for example, the CEO of Mozilla, who arguing that just even deplatforming people from their services was not enough. He believed that it would require more than just the temporary silencing or even the permanent removal of what he called bad actors. On a recent CNN program, you had a former Facebook officer saying that really we need to maybe think about Verizon, AT&T, and others just try to deplatform, like Newsmax TV or One American News Network. So it's getting pretty strong out there. And even Forbes had a chief content officer warn that companies that might even consider hiring someone who worked in the Trump administration, that we would just assume that everything then your company or firm does is a lie, and actually called for this idea of truth reckoning. So there's really a kind of the wind in the sails right now of individuals that are desiring deplatforming and censorship and the rest. So this will be something we'll be watching here for some time here at Point of View. And it's a conversation we'll have tomorrow with Rachel Bovard. Will be in the second hour. By the way, Robert George of Princeton will be with us in the first hour, so I think you'll appreciate some of those issues. My third article, which I thought I'd mention real quickly, has to do with the fact that there are some that are trying to figure out, with all of these executive orders, how many people are going to lose their jobs. The argument which was made when you actually saw the decision to shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, the argument that was made at the time, this would cost, according to this article, 11,000 jobs directly and could indirectly affect up to 60,000 jobs indirectly. Now you're getting some various people doing some fact checks out there, and some are saying maybe that's too extreme, that's maybe too large of a number. That's certainly a possibility. But I think that's the first issue. Then the other day I got this email where it was talking about some of these executive orders would result in the loss of 50,000 jobs. And at the time I thought, okay, well, I got 11,000 jobs with the Keystone XL pipeline. Where do the other 39,000 come from, or 40,000, whatever number you want to use. And the argument was, well, that would be then those people affected directly by the decision to no longer continue the construction of our wall on the southern border. And so that was another number that people are using. But now this particular article quotes from the Senior Vice President of Policy Economics and Regulatory Affairs at the American Petroleum Institute. Now recognize they themselves obviously believe that you should have jobs in oil and gas development, and they have wanted to certainly develop certain areas. And as a result, because of the decision by the incoming president to especially put a permanent ban on development in federal waters and land, and that includes offshore drilling, all sorts of things, they estimate that that could cost 1 million American jobs. So again, we can have debates about how many hundreds of thousands of jobs or million jobs are going to be affected. But I do have a question, and it's a reasonable question. Given the fact that this is going to cost jobs, how is that better for the United States? How is that better for the American people? How is that going to give us energy independence? How is that going to affect the price that you pay for gas at the pump? Those are reasonable questions, but when you ask those questions, people say, sit down, be quiet. You shouldn't ask those questions, or you're too greedy, or something of that nature. It's kind of like the questions about immigration. Okay, we're going to allow a lot more people to come into this country. We recognize that. And candidate Joe Biden said, why the big concern? We can easily assimilate 2 million people. And his argument was, when we have more than 300 million people, we can assimilate 2 million people. And of course, my argument is, well, yes, but we already bring in 1 million people legally, and we actually require that when they come in legally that they take actual classes and actually show that they understand America, and then they take a citizenship test before they raise their right hand and become full citizens of the United States. If you're saying 2 million, including that 1 million, okay, you're wanting to double the number of people coming in, but do you mean those people coming in legally? Or are you talking about the individuals that have been here illegally for decades and bringing in many more? After all, there's a caravan heading towards the southern border right now. And when you ask those questions, again, you're saying, what are you, xenophobic? What are you, racist? Don't you care about these people that are coming from difficult situations? And I go, no, but I just want to ask the question, how are we going to assimilate them at a time when we already have so many people out of work? Bringing in people that maybe don't have the best job skills, are they going to be permanently out of work? How's that going to affect this country? And again, you're not allowed to ask those questions, but I think it's about time for some of us to ask those questions. And even if we can't get answers from this administration, I think you should ask them at various town hall meetings with your member of Congress about the number of jobs that have just been cut with a few executive orders, the number of what could be millions of people that are going to be brought into this country. How are we going to do that? And what's going to be the impact? And if you're shouted down for asking those questions, maybe that tells you a lot about how they really don't have answers for those questions, as illustrated by some of the problems we've had at the border with the whole issue of deportation. Anyway, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do those very quick comments about some of these other articles I've posted on the website right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to South Carolina first, WLPE. David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for taking my call. My question or suggestion is, it seems like the only card we have left to play is if 2/3 of the states of this country can come together, we can override anything that comes out of Washington. What do you think of the possibilities of that happening?
Well, first of all, trying to get 2/3 of the states to agree on anything, that even the sky is blue, is kind of difficult. But what would be the mechanism? Are you thinking like a constitutional convention or just a disagreement or something exactly like that?
Right. Yeah, because it's in the Constitution that they can come together. I mean, with all the radical things they've come, they might cross the line that even some moderate people might even be a little bit upset about.
So I think what you're talking about is just to educate our listeners is what's called an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Now, let's be honest and recognize that a fair number of conservatives have had questions about that. Our friends at Eagle Forum have. We have other people. Mike Ferris has talked about this and has been positive towards it. Certainly a variety of others. Mark Levin fits into that category and others that say that. But it's an interesting concept, and it's kind of back to how far would we have to go before you could actually get some level of agreement. Now, to be fair, there are some cases in which, apart from having a constitutional convention or secession or all the things that people have been talking about, just action items, and in particular, there have been some statements and some actions being taken right now. I mentioned just in passing the issue of immigration. I didn't really get into it today, but we did talk about that on Friday in terms of deportation, which would take place. And the challenging, in this case, came from the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, challenging that executive order. So there are some remedies, but you raise a good question. And that is, how much are we willing to push back before we finally say enough is enough? And when will there be enough courage on the part of some of our elected officials in that regard? So, David, thank you for bringing that up. Maybe we'll pursue some of that tomorrow, because we're going to have Robert George with us. It'll be fascinating to see what he might have to say about some of that. Just before we wind down, only got a few minutes left. My fourth and final article is about the decision by this president to cancel or disband, whatever you want to say, or kill the 1776 Commission. Now, I recognize that compared to some of these other things, like the Keystone XL pipeline, stopping the construction of the wall, promoting transgenderism, stopping deportation, whatever that might be, this may not seem that significant. But it is in this sense, because if you've listened to Point of View, we oftentimes like to talk about America's godly heritage. We like to talk about our history. And there seems to be a real desire on the part of this administration and this president to show that they disagree with the things that appeared in the 1776 Commission. And so they seem to be siding with the New York Times 1619 Project, which says that this country was founded on slavery and that really even the American Revolution was fought to perpetuate the institution of slavery. That's not certainly something we would want to hold to. And Victor Davis Hanson, who's been on the program with us before and actually served on the commission the other day, said that, in any other age, this report would have not been even seen as controversial. He says the conclusions were unanimously approved by a group that included historians, lawyers, academics, scholars, authors, public servants. We've interviewed a lot of those individuals right here on Point of View. And Mike Sabo even points out that really the commission did some things we've talked about because it was appealing both to human reason and biblical revelation. Talked about the Declaration's references to the Creator, to providence, and the idea of a supreme judge. It even called for families that should raise morally responsible citizens who love America and embrace the gifts and responsibilities of freedom and self-government. It actually encouraged state and local governments to produce curricula that conveyed an enlightened patriotism through reading primary sources, and even encourage songwriters and filmmakers and social influencers to actually speak to the eternal truths that embody the American spirit. So I think that this is a good example of something that in a previous age would not have been controversial. No president would have ever thinking of dissolving that particular commission. But it tells you a great deal about what this president and his administration actually thinks about the country and the founding of this nation. And it kind of reminded me of a famous quote from Ronald Reagan. So maybe we'll wind down with that today, because Ronald Reagan one time said that freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. He says, we don't pass it down to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. And one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States when men were free. And that, I think, is one of the great concerns that I have, is that we are really just one generation away from socialism, communism, tyranny, whatever phrase you want to use. And if nothing else, that's why I think something like the 1776 Commission was something that was a great achievement, and yet it only was able to issue one report before President Biden killed it. Just before we take a break, let me mention that I do every once in a while look at what seems to be a curse. Some of you sports people out there might remember the curse of the Bambino. That's the curse that struck the Boston Red Sox. Looked like a long time before they were going to make their way to a World Series and finally win that, but that was the so-called curse of the Bambino. Those of you that love sports, maybe you have heard of the jinx, the Sports Illustrated jinx or curse. You know, if you end up on the front cover of Sports Illustrated, your particular sports career tanks. Well, I think there's another curse, and that is the curse that comes to anybody that mocks the idea of a cancel culture. We are starting to see more and more examples of that, and that unfolded over the weekend, where Lauren Wolf was canceled from the New York Times. Now, interestingly enough, people went back and found that she actually made fun of and mocked the existence of a cancel culture in a tweet that came out in August of 2020. And so then the writer here says, like clockwork, anytime someone on the left is canceled, it almost always turns out that they previously laughed at the idea that the cancel culture even exists. And then they go on to say, the arrogance of such is not lost on those who are sitting back and observing how the left so often eats its own. Goes on to say a little bit later, the right has been warning for years that it's not healthy to have this cancel culture. Yet, of course, Wolf and her colleagues mocked any discussion on the matter at all. Now they have to live by the new rules. I thought that was kind of interesting. So we're seeing the evidence of a cancel culture curse. And one other one, which maybe I'll bring up on our Friday weekend edition, we have Amazon right now complaining that they don't want mail-in balloting for the union election. This would be the same Amazon and Jeff Bezos that were promoting the idea of mail-in ballots during the presidential election. But now they don't want to have mail-in ballots and mail-in voting for a union election for Amazon. And again, you just have to smile. As we oftentimes say, you just can't make this stuff up, and that's why we cover it here on Point of View. It's all we have for today. I'm looking forward to Robert George tomorrow, Rachel Bovard, and of course we'll cover some more stories in the news. You can find all of these articles I've been quoting from on our website, pointofview.net. And most importantly, I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes. I want to thank Steve as well. As you go to the website, you will see my Viewpoints commentary today. You can even sign up for it. And if nothing else, we hope that we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.